Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Sir Stewart Eldon, former UK Permanent Representative to NATO, UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, and British Ambassador to Ireland. Stewart, it's a great pleasure to see you here, and many thanks for agreeing to speak to the European Risk Management Council. Welcome. And as you know, the past couple of years have been marked by extreme geopolitical volatility. Could you please share your insight on the most dangerous geopolitical fault lines that we should be watching for?
Thanks, Evgueni, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You don't need me to tell you that we're self-evidently in a time of turmoil and geostrategic change. In one sense, though, this is a growing opportunity for businesses like yours rather than a threat. I'd like to draw your attention to what I see as four emerging trends, draw three conclusions, and make five suggestions for how you as businesses might address and mitigate risk. So what's been happening and what should we expect? First, threats to security are growing. In East Asia, you don't need me to tell you about increasing Chinese assertiveness. Obvious, for example, in the way China is currently treating Philippine Coast Guard vessels asserting their maritime territorial claims. This and many other things are causing many governments to reassess their strategic priorities. Australia and Japan are changing their defense posture, partly but only partly motivated by the potential threat to Taiwan. The US is pivoting towards the Pacific, a policy that seemed unlikely to change whatever administration is elected in November. And even a weakened post-Brexit UK is putting increased effort and resource into the region. Closer to Europe, the implications of the war in Ukraine continue to have a major impact. On a micro level, it's quite interesting to observe that after 2 years, the increased costs of avoiding Russian airspace have caused both British Airways and Virgin Atlantic to cease flying to China, leaving the London market open to Chinese and other carriers. But the broader geostrategic implications are much more serious. President Zelensky is fighting a clever war. And in my view, the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk Oblast in Russia was long overdue in military strategic terms, both to send a message to President Putin and to underline to the Ukraine's Western backers the need for greater flexibility in the use of weapons they've supplied. But this should not be read as a shift towards preparing for early peace negotiations, and it's risky, as recent Russian aerial attacks across Ukraine have shown. A key question is going to be President Putin's willingness to escalate the weapons he uses. Recently, the Russians have let it be known that they are now revising their nuclear doctrine, though this is probably more a matter of messaging than action. But so far, Putin has been reluctant to move into the tactical nuclear space, and thankfully this is a rational decision. Israel's war in Gaza has resulted in a major humanitarian crisis, which seems likely to get worse. It's illustrated the limitations of Western influence on Prime Minister Netanyahu, and in the process it's severely damaged Israel's legal and moral reputation, devalued the UN's institutional role, and resulted in significant disruption to international maritime trade. There are obvious further risks of the conflict spreading. But I take some comfort from the fact that ceasefire talks are continuing under the auspices of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. And I also take some comfort from the fact that both Iran and Israel have done their best to avoid conflict in South Lebanon escalating into a broader regional confrontation. These too are rational judgments, made in some cases by non-state actors that do not have a good track record of rationality. But I think it's important to note that even in difficult circumstances, leaders are behaving, making a rational calculation. The second major trend I think is happening is that the global south is becoming more assertive. This is manifesting itself in many ways, including Saudi and other Gulf efforts to diversify from hydrocarbons and increase their global economic state. We're seeing more assertive diplomacy from the Gulf states in conflict zones and in other areas. I'd also like to note China's largest successful attempts to gain political and economic influence and access to critical minerals, and a generally harder international political line taken by governments such as India in the negotiation of bilateral trade agreements, including with the UK. The Gulf states and others have the resources and determination to give these efforts real weight, and it would be interesting to hear your views on whether similar weight is emerging from countries in Southeast Asia. The third trend that I think is noticeable is that democracy is being tested in multiple elections during the course of 2024. So far, I think the prognosis is quite encouraging. Over the last few months, I've become a little less concerned about populism carrying the day, despite the divisive result in the French election, for example. But it's remarkable how the US political landscape has changed since Vice President Harris assumed the mantle of Democratic Party candidate. This suggests that what voters really want is leaders they are confident will govern well, or at least not govern badly. I'm pretty sure that this consideration underpinned the Labour Party landslide victory in the UK. Prime Minister Starmer's government now faces the difficult task of breaking hard economic news to those who gave it office without falling into the trap of behaving like its predecessor. It will be interesting to see how this turns out over the next few weeks and the forthcoming UK budget. My fourth trend is that domestic and electoral issues in many Western countries, and actually in others throughout the world, are pulling effort, resources, and attention away from fundamental geopolitical concerns. In the US, congressional struggles over aid to Ukraine are a classic example of this. There are many other examples in the developed world, and I suspect the developing world too. Migration is a particular problem that governments of both North and South have failed to get to grips. So, what conclusions can we draw? First, geostrategy, both security and economic, needs to be given more prominence in political debate. This is far from easy in a global election year, but business, if it wishes, can help provide the rigorous analysis necessary to provoke reflection and debate in a way that governments currently cannot. In the UK, media organisations have recently sponsored substantial studies on both health and education. There and in Europe, the tech giants are becoming more assertive in trying to shape the debate, of course their way, over AI and the management of social media. Secondly, mass matters. This is true in both defence and other geostrategic areas. It's not sufficient in matters of both hard and economic security to rely on diplomatic smoke and mirrors. Recent commentators on Ukraine have argued correctly that while new technology is crucial in defending Ukraine, tanks, infantry, and ammunition matter a lot too. There are lessons here for Western and other governments in determining the size and structure of their militaries, as well as in maintaining sufficient equipment stocks to fight and win a long war. I won't labour the obvious commercial opportunities here, some of low risk, others not. Thirdly, international institutions are already changing and will change further. Within NATO, the accession of Sweden and Finland and the major Polish defence effort is going to lead to a change in the balance of power and appointments within the alliance. AUKUS and new Japanese defence arrangements with the UK and the US may also change the balance in East Asia. In the UN, the credibility of the Security Council has been damaged by prolonged differences among the P5 over Syria and Ukraine. Gaza hasn't helped. Within the constraints of the Charter, the G77 majority are increasingly active. The barriers to significant reform are such that they may simply choose to deprioritise the UN rather than attempt to change it. A further manifestation, I think, of the decreasing potency of increasing international institutions is the growing number of national or multinational initiatives designed to address new problems, such as AI, internet governments, hydrocarbon diversification, and critical minerals. All these are at a relatively early stage, but there is at least a recognition that these issues can't be tackled by governments alone, and that there must be a role for the private sector and other interested actors. All these changes are going to place increasing demands on national leaderships, which currently, I have to say, are only partly being met. So what does this mean for business? How can you mitigate organizational risk and take advantage of the undoubted opportunities that will present themselves? Here I'd make 5 points. Firstly, increasingly strategy will involve the application of novel and asymmetric levers. Governments will be increasingly unable to fill all the gaps. So as businesses, think about where you fit in. Work on, for example, critical minerals can only be a joint effort between governments, the private sector, and NGOs. Secondly, know what the real problems are. Full understanding requires knowledge of local cultures, politics, actors, and needs, so as to be able to balance complex tensions. Thirdly, know what your real interests are. This is never easy. Think long as well as short term. Be consistent. I'd guess that for this audience, key parameters are likely to be stability and predictability, though both are very hard to achieve in today's world. Fourthly, develop long-term influencing networks where your interests matter. This applies as much to your home base as to overseas. Get to know the real influences on a particular issue. Increasingly, they may not be the obvious ones. And finally, do bear in mind that the ability of governments to call the shots on many strategic issues is likely to decline. So think about what skills and capabilities you need to supplement those gaps and build your organizations. How can you develop those capabilities? What's your USP? Very often in the private sector, it may simply be speed and flexibility of response. So over time, I suspect government will need to get a bit more like the private sector in its methods, and the private sector will need to improve its understanding of and leverage with government. Both will have to cope with new actors who don't follow established norms of behavior and who frankly, they don't quite understand. The key to this is both building in-house capability and knowing where to get the advice you need. It may well have to come from outside either sector and from people who know both.
Stewart, thank you very much for your insightful talk. Thank you, and I hope we will see you soon at the future European Risk Management Council meetings.
Thank you very much, Evgueni.